Opening the center for active piece development, this pawn thrust immediately stakes a claim in the heart of the board. An immediate fight for central space begins, setting the stage for a dynamic and often sharp Sicilian defense. Instantly eyeing central control, this knight prepares to contest black's space while developing aggressively. Opening the way for the queen and bishop, this solidifies the center but may slow queenside development slightly. A solid, unassuming pawn push, preparing to develop the bishop and solidify the center without immediate confrontation. Developing a knight to its natural square here reinforces the pawn chain and prepares for kingside castling. Preparing fianchetto for the king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the center, potentially leading to a solid positional game. Developing the knight to the 7th rank conserves flexibility, potentially rerouting it to a more active square later without committing to a single flank. Developing the bishop solidifies the kingside and prepares for kingside castling, creating a harmonious structure. Building a fianchettoed structure aims for long-term pawn control and piece development, but risks creating weaknesses around the king. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away behind a pawn phalanx, white now prepares to activate the remaining pieces, aiming to consolidate a favorable kingside pawn structure before any decisive clashes erupt in the center. Developing the bishop to its fianchetto square solidifies the dark squares and prepares to challenge white's queenside space advantage. Solidifying the d4 square and preparing a potential queen's pawn push offers flexibility, creating a stable pawn structure for future development and pawn breaks. Seizing central space decisively, this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's comfortable setup, aiming to untangle black's pieces and activate the bishop pair, creating a dynamic imbalance. Unifying the queen with the development of the kingside pawns signals an intent to bolster the center and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm or a central break with f4. This maneuver subtly redirects pressure, potentially aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's uncastled king, or to solidify white's central pawn structure before committing to a more aggressive plan. Finally, the black king finds its sanctuary, a crucial step in solidifying the kingside structure against white's growing central presence. Pushing the pawn forward creates a significant pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's kingside development and potentially open lines on the queenside for white's pieces. Unleashing the pawn storm, black seeks immediate counterplay on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable development and potentially open lines towards the king. This aggressive pawn push signals a bold intention to seize the initiative, though it creates potential weaknesses on the dark squares and may invite complications. It fundamentally challenges white's central control and demands a precise response to avoid being overwhelmed. Releasing the central tension with the pawn exchange opens up attacking avenues for your pieces, creating dynamic imbalances rather than static positions. Unshackling the light-squared bishop from its pawn chain unlocks diagonals and prepares for potential kingside pressure. Clearing the king's shadow, this bishop relocates to an aggressive outpost, intending to exchange its counterpart and weaken black's pawn shield protecting the monarch. Shifting the rook from its previous post on the king's side allows it to potentially contest the open e-file, while simultaneously preparing to support a pawn push of f5 later, aiming to gain more central territory and restrict white's pieces. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm on the king's side, white boldly ventures g4, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and expose the king. This maneuver immediately creates significant dynamic tension, forcing black to confront the encroaching threat and consider the implications for their own king's safety. The pawn push also opens up diagonal lines for white's pieces, potentially creating immediate tactical opportunities. Black must carefully assess whether to meet this aggression head-on with counterplay or adopt a more passive defensive stance. Unleashing a pawn storm, black confronts white's central foothold, immediately challenging the imposing e5 pawn and seeking to crack open lines for active piece play. This aggressive thrust aims to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain and potentially expose the kingside. Pondering the king's safety, white opts to solidify the kingside pawn structure, creating a subtle barrier against black's encroaching influence and preparing for potential pawn advancements like g5. Embracing the closed center, black introduces the queen to a more active central square, eyeing potential targets on the kingside while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file, a maneuver that injects a dynamic element into what has been a rather slow development. Liberating the queenside pawn structure and challenging black's central foothold is a bold attempt to disrupt the static pawn wall. Black decisively injects dynamism into the center, challenging white's established pawn chain and opening lines that could prove critical, forcing a reevaluation of the pawn structure's integrity. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the opponent's center, this capture suddenly opens lines and forces a dramatic shift in the game's dynamic, creating imbalances that will need careful navigation. Black recaptures, opening lines and creating immediate central dynamic that demands white's careful attention. Aggressively probing the enemy king's sanctuary, this knight's forward surge aims to dismantle black's pawn shield and create immediate tactical fireworks around the castled monarch. Injecting the knight into the heart of white's kingside, this piece repositioning creates immediate tactical skirmishes and challenges white's advanced pawn structure, aiming to disrupt its cohesion and exploit the newly opened diagonals. Seizing the initiative, this capture dramatically reshapes the central battleground, opening vital lines while simultaneously exposing the knight on d4 to an immediate threat. Black's knight now retreats to a safer square, finally acknowledging the danger to its central presence, while subtly reinforcing the pawn chain and aiming to reroute its pieces towards the kingside. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and create attacking possibilities on the kingside, a bold response to the knight's daring sortie to d4. The bishop tucks into a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the weak squares that have emerged, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn on e4, which is currently a significant thorn in white's side. Unleashing the queen to d3 aggressively seeks to exploit the now open e-file, aiming to disrupt black's central control and potentially create a pawn storm on the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop on g2 unleashes the pawn storm on the kingside, creating significant structural weaknesses for white. Exposing the king to open lines dramatically reduces its safety, a consequence that often outweighs the immediate material gain of capturing the bishop. Reclaiming the central files becomes paramount for black, as the knight on d4, while active, can be dislodged, and a more robust presence on the d-file is essential for future operations. This knight's journey to the kingside, specifically targeting the f6 square, aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially isolate the weakened light squares around the king. It sacrifices immediate central pawn pressure for long-term strategic advantage, hoping to exploit the now exposed dark-squared bishop. The queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing the d4 outpost and potentially reinforcing the kingside should an opportunity arise, while also clearing the way for the rook to potentially join the central battle. Re-establishing a central presence, this rook redeployment aims to both contest the open e-file and support the kingside pawn push, potentially unbalancing black's otherwise solid structure. Shifting the king away from the congested center and potential open files demonstrates a clear priority for safety, subtly reinforcing the pawn chain's protection and preparing for potential future action by freeing up the g7 bishop's diagonal should the opportunity arise. The rook's arrival on the open d-file immediately signals white's intention to contest control of this crucial central avenue, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities, especially with the bishop pair now activated. Unleashing the knight to f5 injects immediate chaos into white's meticulously constructed central pawn chain, threatening to shatter the pawn barricade and expose the white king's cozy setup. Unlocking the d-file for infiltration, white boldly sacrifices pawn structure to challenge black's centralized knight and prepare a kingside assault. A bold, forcing sequence that opens lines for the black king, embracing the ensuing chaos to disrupt white's pawn structure. Recentering the king on f1, a pivotal decision, sacrifices the immediate fight for the kingside outpost while seeking to consolidate. This repositioning prepares for a more strategic approach, potentially eyeing central control or a robust defense. The abandoned g4 pawn now becomes a point of potential weakness. Re-establishing a defensive network around the king by repositioning the knight to the relative safety of g8, acknowledging the loss of dynamism after white's aggressive kingside push, now seeks to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay, rather than immediately challenging the advanced white pieces which might expose black's own king to further danger. Opening up the kingside further, white sacrifices a knight to fracture black's pawn structure and unleash the potent bishop on h6. Trading rooks here is an unavoidable concession, simplifying the position and acknowledging white's current material and space advantage. Reclaiming the open file after the bishop exchange is paramount. The rook now stands ready to exploit any weakness that arises on the central files and pressure black's isolated pawn if it dares to advance further. Re-establishing a knight on a key central square, this move aims to bolster the kingside defenses and potentially launch a counteroffensive towards white's exposed monarch, leveraging the open d-file for future maneuvering. Clearing the overloaded d-file while preparing to contest the central open files with your rooks, this queen maneuver is a necessary step to regain initiative after black's determined pawn push.